Hello. General Hospital today will revealing the trial surrounding Drew's shooting, once believed to be heading toward its inevitable conclusion, unexpectedly unraveled into a dark and unjust spectacle that no one could have predicted. What had started as a pursuit of truth became a masterclass in misdirection and silent betrayal. For weeks, public suspicion had firmly fixated on Michael, a devoted brother, a loving father, and a steadfast son-in-law. The weight of the investigation crushed down on him, not because of any clear evidence, but because the narrative needed a villain. In a world ruled by perception rather than fact, Michael was the easiest target. But lurking beneath the layers of courtroom theatrics, media speculation, and fractured family dynamics was a truth so appalling, so unthinkable, that its mere exposure could shatter everything. Willow, the woman seen by many as gentle, fragile, and emotionally spent, was the one who had pulled the trigger, and the only person who knew this with certainty was Alexis, a woman who once symbolized unshakable integrity in the justice system. Alexis uncovered the truth not in a dramatic moment of revelation, but through the slow accumulation of overlooked details. There were inconsistencies in the timeline, the faint imprint of a ringtone that didn't belong, fragments of Drew's recollections that began to coalesce into a damning picture. Where others saw chaos, Alexis saw patterns. But the clarity of truth brought with it an unbearable burden. She knew what exposing Willow would mean: the destruction of Drew's fragile recovery, the psychological fallout for Scout, and the disintegration of a family already hanging by a thread. She stood at the precipice of her duty as a legal professional and her instinct as a protector. And in the silence of that moral crossroads, she made her choice. She chose silence. Worse, she reshaped her closing argument to deflect suspicion from Willow and subtly implicate Michael, planting doubt where none existed. A respected attorney turned reluctant co-conspirator, Alexis compromised the very essence of justice she once fought to uphold. At the center of it all stood Drew, the man whose body bore the wound, but whose soul now bore an even deeper scar. He should have been the victim, the one deserving of vindication and clarity. Instead, he became the shield willingly, consciously, tragically. His decision not to speak the truth wasn't born from fear, but from something more insidious, a delusion that he was preserving something. Perhaps he believed he was giving Willow a second chance, that by protecting her, he was saving a life instead of condemning another. Perhaps he thought that if he forgave the woman who shot him, he could salvage whatever pieces of normalcy remained. Or maybe, he simply couldn't bear to see Scout's world fracture further. But by choosing to protect Willow, Drew didn't just silence justice, he betrayed it. He betrayed Michael, the man who had stood beside him through crisis after crisis, the man who had helped raise Scout, the man who was now being hung in the court of public opinion for a crime he never committed. Drew's betrayal wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, almost invisible. It came in the form of withheld testimony, the soft refusal to confirm what he knew in his heart. It was in the way he sat through the trial, watching Michael endure accusation after accusation, never once stepping forward to stop it. The loyalty Michael had shown him became meaningless in that courtroom, overshadowed by Drew's need to control the fallout and maintain the illusion of order. It was a betrayal not just of one man, but of everything that justice was supposed to represent. Meanwhile, Willow sat behind her veil of innocence, her tears perfectly timed, her voice just shaky enough. But beneath that fragile mask lay a simmering truth, one she refused to acknowledge. She let the trial unfold, let Michael suffer, let Drew sacrifice, all while clinging to her freedom. She told herself it was for the children, for her future, for the family. But deep down, she knew she was running from the only thing that could redeem her, the truth. And that refusal to confess became her silent weapon, cutting down the very people who once loved her. This case, once about justice for Drew, had morphed into a perverse charade. It wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore, it was about control, image, and the uncomfortable convenience of silence. And in that space, where truth was buried and innocence manipulated, the real victim was left standing alone. Michael had not just lost his freedom, he had lost his place in the family, his relationship with his children, and the fundamental trust that once held his world together. All of it taken by a lie that everyone knew but no one dared to confront. And yet, The truth remains, silenced but not erased, hidden but not forgotten. A truth that will one day claw its way back to the surface because lies, no matter how carefully constructed, cannot hold forever. And when that day comes, the real reckoning will begin not in a courtroom, but in the shattered hearts and fractured souls of those who chose silence over justice. Willow, through the strange and calculated protection of Drew and the deliberate, strategic silence of Alexis, walked away from the courtroom a free woman. Despite the blood on her hands and the truth buried beneath layers of deception, she was declared innocent. Not only was she spared conviction or incarceration, she suffered no loss whatsoever. In fact, she emerged from the trial having gained something more significant than her freedom: full custody of Wiley and Amelia. It was a cruel twist of fate, one that redefined injustice in its most intimate form. The two children, once safe and happy in Michael's arms, were now transferred into the custody of the very woman responsible for tearing their family apart. It was as though the system had handed a prize to the perpetrator, while the innocent was left to shoulder the unbearable cost. For Michael, the aftermath was more than a legal defeat. It was an emotional exile, stripped not only of his rights as a father, but also of his dignity. He now stood alone, isolated by the same people he had once trusted with his life. The public scrutiny was relentless, the whispers louder with each passing day, and the legal system that once promised fairness had now branded him as expendable. But nothing compared to the hollow ache of losing his children. That pain ran deeper than anything else. He had never imagined that those he loved most would be taken from him not by strangers or enemies, but by those who once called him family. The irony grew sharper when it came to Wiley. A perceptive and emotionally intelligent child, Wiley had always gravitated toward Michael. He clung to him during difficult nights, found comfort in his voice, and trusted him in a way that went beyond mere parental attachment. Michael had been his constant, his source of security and unconditional love. And yet, now, Wiley was forced into a living arrangement that neither he nor Michael had chosen. Though the boy didn't entirely reject Willow, he sensed something had changed. The warmth he felt with Michael was now replaced by a quiet confusion. He couldn't articulate it fully, but he knew he had been taken from the one place he felt truly safe. Wiley had become a pawn, a silent victim of a trial manipulated by adults who prioritized self-preservation over truth. No one had asked what he wanted. No one had stopped to consider the emotional cost to a child being yanked from one home to another. Under the shadow of deceit, his voice had been drowned out by legal motions and political maneuvering. His agency stripped away by those sworn to protect him. And for Michael, watching Wiley slip from his life without a proper goodbye was the cruelest cut of all. Meanwhile, Michael spiraled into a painful isolation. It wasn't just the temporary loss of freedom that haunted him, it was the deeper, more lasting fracture of trust. The justice system, which he had once defended, had become a weapon turned against him. The family he had poured his life into had become distant, hesitant, and in some cases, complicit in his downfall. Alexis's silence, Drew's calculated sacrifice, and Willow's betrayal all collided into a singular, devastating realization. He had been abandoned not because he failed, but because his innocence was inconvenient. Everything he had built, his reputation, his career, his role as a father, now lay in ruins. The foundations of his identity had cracked under the weight of a lie so skillfully preserved that even the truth felt like fiction. The people who once assured him of their support had vanished into shadows of doubt. They didn't see the anguish in his eyes or the quiet way he checked his phone at night, hoping for a message from Wiley. They didn't witness the way he stood by the window, half expecting to see Amelia's smile in the distance. His pain became invisible, buried beneath the narrative that had been crafted against him. In truth, Michael wasn't just grieving the loss of his children, he was mourning the death of the life he once believed in. The home that had once echoed with laughter was now silent. The future he had envisioned was shattered. And worst of all, he was forced to relive that betrayal every time he saw a picture of Willow smiling with the very children she had taken from him. The public saw a mother reclaiming her family. Michael saw a facade built on manipulation and cowardice. Yet, beneath the layers of despair, something within Michael remained unbroken. The ache of injustice stirred a quiet defiance. He knew he hadn't failed as a father. He hadn't failed as a man. The world may have turned its back on him, but he would not turn his back on the truth. He clung to the memory of Wiley's hand in his, of Amelia's giggle at bedtime, of all the moments that had made his life worth living. And he vowed silently, stubbornly, that one day the truth would be undeniable. That one day, those children would know who had fought for them, even when the world insisted he had no right to. Because love, real love, does not vanish with a verdict. And Michael, though broken, was not defeated. Not yet. Meanwhile, Alexis was left to carry a burden that no verdict could erase. She had stood at the intersection of truth and self-preservation, holding in her hands the very evidence that could have shifted the course of the trial, altered lives, and restored justice. She had known the truth, had seen it unfold before her with painful clarity. But in the end, she had chosen compromise, to protect Drew, to shield Scout from further damage, and perhaps, most damning of all, to preserve what remained of her own legacy in the legal world. Alexis kept silent. That decision, born from a complex web of loyalty, fear, and self-interest, did more than protect a guilty party. It called into question everything Alexis once represented. She had been a symbol of moral authority, of resilience in the face of injustice, and now, she stood as a woman haunted by her own betrayal of those ideals. A lawyer who had once fought for truth was now a keeper of secrets, and the weight of that hypocrisy was crushing her from within. Each day that passed after the verdict was not a moment of relief for Alexis. It was a ticking clock, counting down to an inevitable reckoning. The legal community, though not yet aware of the full scope of her omission, had begun to whisper, and Alexis herself could not escape the silent judgment that followed her reflection in the mirror. The law had been her life's work, her compass, her sanctuary. But now, that very system had been weaponized by her silence, and every moment she remained complicit in the lie, the further she drifted from the woman she once believed herself to be. Diane, however, refused to be part of the farce. She saw through the courtroom charade for what it truly was: a grotesque parody of justice, a calculated miscarriage of law, and an offense to every innocent person who had ever stood trial. For Diane, this wasn't just a case gone wrong. It was a scandal that tainted the entire fabric of the judicial process. It was a disgrace not only to Michael, who now carried the cross of wrongful accusation, but to the profession they both had sworn to uphold with integrity. Her indignation turned to action. She began quietly gathering what remained of the discarded evidence, determined to build a case not for legal retribution, but for public truth. Among the items retrieved was the overlooked audio evidence, a ringtone that matched Willow's burner device, a sound that had echoed in the seconds before the gunshot. It was a detail too small for most to notice, but Diane knew better than to underestimate subtlety. If the courts would not retry Willow due to the constitutional protection against double jeopardy, then Diane would take the battle beyond the bench. She would expose the truth to the public, to the press, and to those who had already begun to doubt the verdict. If she couldn't exonerate Michael through legal channels, she would vindicate him in the only way left, by revealing everything the system refused to confront. But she wouldn't be fighting alone. Two voices, long silenced by fear and manipulation, were finally ready to speak. Trina, who had watched helplessly as her friend was dragged through the mud for a crime he never committed, could no longer remain a bystander. She had witnessed firsthand how justice could be twisted by those in power, and how silence could become a weapon as deadly as a bullet. She realized that by staying quiet, she had allowed a lie to thrive, and she would not make that mistake again. Kai, equally burdened by what he had seen and heard, recognized the danger of further inaction. He had carried the secret too long, knowing that the night of the shooting held moments and conversations that had never been disclosed. The fear that once silenced him was now replaced by guilt and a burning sense of duty. Together, they became the first crack in the wall of deception. As these truths slowly emerged, Willow began to unravel. Though she walked free in the eyes of the law, she had imprisoned herself in a far more brutal sentence: her conscience. Each night, the silence of the house gnawed at her. Each glance from Drew, whether filled with pity or confusion, reminded her of what she had done. She tried to justify it to herself, to bury the memory of the trigger beneath layers of trauma. fear, and survival. But no rationalization could extinguish the guilt that coiled inside her. She began to withdraw, not out of shame, but because the weight of maintaining the facade had become unbearable. Drew's presence was both comfort and curse. He had once been the object of her rage, her confusion, her fear. Now he was the symbol of everything she had stolen. Each morning he struggled to rise from bed. Each time he reached for something and winced in pain. Each moment of silence between them, these were the invisible bars of the prison she now lived in. Willow was not in a jail cell, but she was serving a sentence far more personal. She saw the ghost of her guilt in the smiles of her children, in the emptiness of Michael's absence, and in the echo of the truth she had tried so hard to bury. She could not escape the knowledge that she had destroyed a man's life to protect her own, that she had let her fear dictate her morality, that she had taken advantage of Drew's mercy, Alexis's weakness, and Michael's love and weaponized all three. No courtroom would ever convict her. No handcuffs would ever close around her wrists. But the punishment she faced now was far more corrosive than any cell. A life spent pretending to be innocent while knowing she had stained every relationship she once held dear. And still, the truth clawed its way forward through Diane's defiance, Trina's bravery, Kai's memory, and Alexis's crumbling silence. The story was no longer just about who pulled the trigger. It was about who kept it hidden, who paid the price, and who would finally bring it all to light. Willow's world, carefully constructed to resemble redemption, was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own lies. And when it did, the fallout would reach far beyond her into the very core of a family that once believed love could survive anything, even the truth. Meanwhile, Michael slowly began to reclaim the strength that had been stripped from him. At first, the aftermath of the trial left him broken, isolated, and disoriented. But pain has a way of awakening something deeper: clarity, resilience, purpose. In the silence that followed the verdict, in the empty moments when the absence of Wiley and Amelia became too loud to ignore, Michael realized that waiting for justice to fix itself was a fantasy. No one was going to return what had been stolen from him, not the courts, not the press, not even the family members who had stood by and watched him fall. If the truth was going to survive, it had to start with him. If anyone was going to protect his children from growing up in a world where power could bury facts, where twisted emotions could manipulate justice, it would have to be their father, the man they once knew not just as protector, but as the example of what it meant to stand for something real. Michael's decision to fight wasn't born from vengeance, it came from love. A love so rooted in truth that he refused to let it be erased by lies, no matter how convincing or widely accepted. He knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy. He would be painted as bitter, unstable, even obsessed. But what choice did he have? Wiley deserved to know that his father never gave up. Amelia deserved to grow up with a model of courage, not quiet defeat. And the people who had been silenced or scapegoated: Kai, Trina. Even Diane deserved someone willing to pick up the pieces and keep going. Michael would be that someone. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Because if he didn't, then everything he believed in would be reduced to dust. The end of the trial was never truly an end. It was a false resolution, a hollow closing argument delivered in the name of legal convenience. For Michael, it marked the beginning of a much greater journey. One not defined by legal battles, but by personal reclamation of his voice, of his name, of the truth that so many had tried to silence. Willow may have won in the eyes of the law. She may have been acquitted, protected, and handed the illusion of peace. But she had lost in far more permanent ways. She had lost the faith of the man who once believed in her. She had lost the silent respect of the friends who now watched her with distant eyes. And most of all, she had lost the moral high ground that once made her a figure of sympathy. Her victory was paper thin, held together only by a verdict, not by the hearts of those she had hurt. Michael, on the other hand, despite being dragged through the mud, had preserved something far more valuable: his integrity. Even when everything was taken from him, even when he was betrayed by the very people he had defended, he never compromised his values. And that endurance became his quiet strength. In the stillness of his solitude, he began gathering the scattered truths that others had overlooked. The records, the audio, the testimony. He started rebuilding not a case, but a truth that could stand on its own. Whether or not the court ever acknowledged it, he no longer needed the gavel of a judge to validate his pain. He needed only the courage to keep speaking, to keep pushing, to make sure that one day, his children would know the full story, not the one written by corrupted systems and manipulated witnesses, but the real one, the story of a man who refused to disappear, who refused to become collateral damage in someone else's narrative. He didn't want Wiley to grow up thinking that silence was safer than resistance. He didn't want Amelia to inherit a legacy built on shame and injustice. He wanted them to see that even in the darkest hour, the truth still had a voice, and that voice could be theirs, too. Michael's fight wasn't loud. It wasn't always visible, but it was constant. Every day, in the choices he made, in the restraint he showed, in the moments when bitterness tried to consume him, and he pushed it away, he was resisting the lie. He was refusing to become what they wanted him to be, broken, irrelevant, erased. And slowly, that resistance began to inspire others. Diane stood taller in her defense of him. Trina found her courage to speak out. Even Alexis, tortured by her own decisions, began to question the cost of her silence. The truth, once buried under layers of manipulation, began to breathe again. Michael held on to the quiet hope that one day, the truth would no longer need to scream to be heard. That one day, the names would be cleared not by law, but by acknowledgement. That justice would finally name the guilty, not to punish, but to restore. And when that day came, it would not be marked by applause or headlines or courtroom drama. It would be marked by something simpler: Wiley asking the right question, Amelia holding her father's hand without confusion, and Michael knowing that he had done the only thing a father can do in the face of injustice: endure. Because the truth, once awakened, does not sleep again. And Michael, though scarred, was now wide awake.